There's a lot of controversies about the Eastern Front in World War II, and I'd like to talk about those. Maybe not all in this video, but maybe in other ones as well, where I can show maps and everything. It's just convenient because I'm driving. But the extent of Soviet-German collaboration prior to 1941 was actually pretty vast. So here's what people don't know. We all know about that Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right? Prior to the war, of course, being able to train the Reichswehr officer cadre back in the Weimar days was completely instrumental in the ability of the Germans to develop Panzer doctrine. And of course, the Russians were also very interested in armored warfare. So first of all, the most effective weapon of the war, the Panzer forces, was developed with Russian assistance. In other words, the Russians helped the Germans circumvent Versailles. Then you have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact itself, which was the catalyst for World War II. Without that agreement, there would have been no Second World War as we know it, because it would have been an open flank for the Germans to have to worry about. So that was a huge issue. The Polish army could have inflicted 60,000 dead on the Germans had they been able to focus just on the Germans themselves. There's reason to believe they would have inflicted even more, and the offensive in the West would have been that much harder to do. Economically, we all know that the Germans and Soviets did a lot of trading during that time. What people don't realize is there was military and secret police cooperation. The Gestapo and NKVD had liaisons on who to hand over both ways. This included Jews. The Soviets gave the Germans a U-boat base in Murmansk. I'm not kidding. They actually did that. Russian oil was in Axis planes from 1940 onward, and it was Russian oil that really made the difference in the Battle of Britain, allowed the Luftwaffe to do a lot of that. It wasn't just the Romanians, okay? That was so huge of a problem that the French and the British were mulling over bombing the Baku fields from Syria, and that actually happened. So there was also, and Russians will deny this to this day, I don't know why, but they will deny this. The Soviets went to Berlin. Molotov went to Berlin. First off, Molotov was put in power to make them more popular with the Axis. That's one of the accusations I've heard. So that's problematic because they fired their other ambassador who was Jewish to suck up to Hitler. In the autumn of 1940, Molotov went to Berlin. That was a tangent. Molotov went to Berlin in order to negotiate territorial concessions from Germany to join the Axis. And the only reason they didn't is because the Germans didn't want to accept giving away parts of Romania and all this and that. And Molotov observed that if the British were beaten, why were they currently bombing Berlin? Very astute observation. Of course, that just covers the beginning of the war. Then throughout the war itself, there's a bunch of claims that are made about the war, which are patently ridiculous. So it's claimed that it's, the biggest front ever. No, that's actually the Pacific. It was a huge front that ate a lot of manpower. But the only reason Stalin ever got attacked in the first place is because he repeatedly, first he gutted his own army with the purges. Secondly, they were caught with their pants down in the middle of a modernization. They didn't have standardized equipment in their motorized and armored formations. And their best commanders, like Rokossovsky, were still in the goddamn gulag. So, it's a bit disingenuous. Stalin had plans on the table, signed off on by Zhukov, to attack Germany. That doesn't excuse the German attack. I don't think the Russians would have been in the least bit successful. They simply would have overextended themselves beyond their rail lines and been annihilated. But the Russian casualty figures are not an argument for Russian sacrifice, they're an argument for Russian incompetence. When you lose your most valuable territory to your enemy within the first 6 months of the war, you lose. The Battle of Kiev was the largest encirclement in history. When you lose battles like that, you do so out of incompetence. When your civilians are then massacred by an insanely racist regime, it's because you allowed them to be conquered. Didn't defend them properly, which is the first duty of any government, really, is to protect its own citizens. So, yes, the Soviets lost a lot of people, but they lost a lot of people because they were incompetent. Vastly incompetent. It actually took upwards of 7-1 numerical advantage in Operation Barbarossa for them to carry out their most lauded offensive of the war. Then there's the fact that you have to ignore the interconnectedness of every front. The Russians never conducted strategic bombing of any sort in the war. They depended on the Western Allies to do this. It's actually why Dresden was obliterated. So the Russians had no operations deep in Germany with bombers. It was, and the Western Allied bombing offensive was deeply effective in first breaking the back of the Luftwaffe, causing the Germans to divert at least 50% of their economy to air defense, causing them to devote 30% of their artillery to air defense, which, looking at the raw numbers, if that artillery had been on the Eastern Front, it would have obliterated the Russian tank forces. Lend-Lease is famous for giving the Russians the ability to have a truck fleet to maintain some of their offensives. Had this not have been sent to Russia, those offensives, by most historians say those offensives would have been a good bit more shallow. With the loss of the Ukrainian grain fields, the Russians were not able to effectively feed their population, so they were getting a lot of food from the West. Some of the key battles are interrelated. So, while Stalingrad was happening, okay, Hitler was shifting some of his best divisions into Tunisia, which were then taken prisoner in greater numbers than the Russians captured at Stalingrad, probably because Italians and Germans were more apt to surrender to the Western Allies, but they bagged more prisoners in that exchange. Then you have the Battle of Kursk. You had a very fierce air battle going on, during which time Hitler transferred entire air fleets from the front around Kursk to the Mediterranean, where they were destroyed because there was Just massive numerical and qualitative superiority with the Allies. Also, during the Battle of Kursk, famously Manstein claims in Lost Victories that he would have been able to achieve a breakthrough after the tactical victory at Prokhorovka, but in reality, the Russians did have just too many reserves, too much depth for that to have been the case. But they halted the offensive because of the landing in Sicily, promptly transferring the strongest of the German formations to the west. Okay, so had that not happened, the Battle of Kursk would have been longer, and there would have likely been more maneuver warfare during the phase of Kutuzov when the Russians counterattacked, launched a counteroffensive. So there's a lot of myths about the Eastern Front, and that's a pretty good overview of them. But the reason this matters is because now you're seeing a Russian narrative emerge around the Second World War, which is mythologizing the war. World War II is also mythologizing the West to a great degree. I mean, I'll admit, people act like D-Day won the war by itself, but to think that the Western Allies would not have, without Soviet Russia, the Western Allies could have won the war. I don't think without the Western Allies, the Soviets could have won the war. I simply base this on the fact that the Americans had the B-29, they had a nuclear bomb program. The British and the Americans had a massive navy, which they would have strangled Germany with. So when you have maritime powers that are able to interdict at will supply lines and then build massive air fleets to level cities, over time that's going to simply wear down German effectiveness. Western divisions were far more deadly to the Germans. It took less of them. You know, sure, the Russians could claim to have had 600 divisions. We all know if those were Western equivalents, those were more like 300. So the numbers game is played by the Germans in claiming they were so outnumbered. It's also played by the Russians in claiming they had so many troops. Human wave attacks were a thing on the tactical level, so denying that is disingenuous. To think that the Russians didn't charge German positions.